The house woke before Margaret did, as if it already knew something was ending, and the soft sounds of morning, floorboards settling, the old heater clicking, the wind brushing the maple trees, felt louder than usual, pressing against her chest while she stood in the kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink, watching her step-grandson Daniel move through the driveway with careful steps, loading his car piece by piece, a suitcase, a box of books, a folded jacket, each movement calm but final, and she felt that strange pull between pride and fear, the kind that arrives when someone you love chooses a path you can't walk beside them, because Daniel was not just leaving the house, he was leaving a version of life that had grown quietly around both of them for years, ever since Robert died and the world narrowed to routines and shared silence, and Margaret remembered how Daniel had come into her life so gently, not as family by blood but by circumstance, a quiet boy with unsure eyes and polite manners, carrying grief he did not know how to name, and she had never tried to claim him, never asked for affection, only offered consistency, warm meals, rides to school, a listening ear when he wanted one, and somehow that steady presence turned into trust, then care, then a bond neither of them ever spoke about, because naming it might have made it fragile, and now, standing at the window, Margaret felt the weight of that bond stretching thin, not breaking, just changing shape, because Daniel was 26 now, tall and thoughtful, with a seriousness that came from watching adults handle loss too early, and when he told her weeks ago that he had applied for a program in Seattle, she had smiled and nodded, even joked about the rain, but inside she felt the quiet fear she hadn't felt since Robert's last days, the fear of an empty space growing larger, and as Daniel closed the trunk, the sound echoed like punctuation at the end of a sentence she wasn't ready to finish, and he paused, looking toward the house as if memorizing it, the porch where they drank tea at night, the steps he repaired last winter, the window where Margaret always stood when he arrived, and for a moment neither of them moved, because words would slow things down and time wasn't waiting, and Margaret realized that this morning wasn't about goodbye speeches or tears, it was about accepting motion, about letting a younger life move forward even when it pulls something precious with it, and she thought about how Daniel had stayed longer than he needed to after college, not because he lacked ambition but because responsibility had wrapped around him, because he worried about leaving her alone, because grief had made him careful, and that knowledge filled her with both gratitude and guilt, because love should never feel like an anchor, and she wondered if she had unknowingly held him back, if her quiet loneliness had been louder than she thought, and when Daniel finally turned and walked toward the house, she straightened her shoulders and reminded herself to be steady, to be the kind of person who sends someone off with courage instead of need, because this was his moment, his decision, and it mattered more than her fear, and as he stepped inside, the familiar smell of wood and old books wrapped around them, and for a second Margaret saw him as that boy again, standing awkwardly in the doorway years ago, unsure if he belonged, and she understood that belonging isn't something you say, it's something you allow, and she allowed him now. Allowed him to leave, even though her heart resisted, even though the rooms behind him already felt quieter, because deep down she sensed that this decision was not only changing Daniel's future, it was pushing her towards something she had avoided for a long time, a life not defined by waiting. And that thought scared her more than the empty house ever could. Daniel did not sit when he came into the dining room, he stood near the chair as if staying upright would make the conversation easier. And Margaret noticed how his hands moved without purpose, touching the back of the chair, the edge of the table, signs of a choice already made but not fully released, and he began to speak in a careful voice, explaining that the program in Seattle was more than a job, it was a long-term commitment to community work, a chance to build something meaningful, something that matched the values he had carried quietly for years, and as his words came faster, Margaret understood this was not sudden. It was the result of many nights of doubt and planning, of fear pushed aside by hope, and she listened without interrupting, even when her chest tightened, because she knew this moment was not about her comfort but about his truth, and when he said he had accepted the offer, not might or maybe but had, the finality settled into the room like a new piece of furniture, awkward at first but real, and then he hesitated, his eyes dropping for a second before he added that he had met someone in Seattle during a short visit, a woman named Emily, someone who listened the way Margaret always had, someone who believed in his ability to grow beyond safe choices, and Margaret felt that sharp mix of relief and sadness, relief that he was not walking into the future alone, sadness that someone else now held a part of his emotional world, but she hid it behind a gentle nod, asking simple questions: how they met, what she was like, where she worked, letting the rhythm of normal conversation soften the weight of change, and Daniel relaxed as she did, speaking more openly, admitting his fear of starting over, of failing, of becoming distant from the life he knew, and Margaret saw clearly that his strength came not from certainty but from courage, and she remembered her own younger self, the choices she delayed, the dreams she folded away for stability, and she realized that Daniel's decision was quietly asking her to reflect on her own, on how many years she had spent standing still, out of loyalty to the past. And as the afternoon light shifted across the table, Margaret reached for her mug and finally took a sip, grounding herself, because this conversation was not an ending but a turning point, and when she told Daniel she was proud of him, the words surprised even her, not because they were untrue but because they carried a release she hadn't known she needed, and Daniel smiled then, a real smile, the kind that comes from being understood without explanation, and in that moment Margaret knew that his decision, though painful, was honest, and honesty was something she respected more than comfort, and as they stood there in the quiet room, both aware that time was moving faster now, Margaret felt a shift inside her, a soft realization that loving someone sometimes means stepping back, not to disappear, but to let both lives expand, even when the space between them grows wider. The days before Daniel's departure moved quickly, each one filled with small tasks that felt heavier than they should, and Margaret noticed how time slipped away while she tried to hold it still, watching Daniel move through the house with a quiet focus, sorting papers, packing clothes, giving away things he no longer needed, and every object he touched seemed to carry a memory, a shared meal, a late conversation, a moment of comfort after a hard day, and she realized how deeply their lives had blended without either of them planning it, and though they spoke often, there were many things left unsaid, not because they lacked trust but because some feelings felt too large for words, and Margaret felt them rising now, especially in the evenings when the house settled into silence and Daniel sat across from her, reading or scrolling on his phone, both aware that these ordinary moments were becoming rare, and one night, as the air turned cold and the porch light flickered on, they sat outside wrapped in blankets, the stars faint but steady above them, and conversation drifted naturally toward the past, toward Robert, toward the long months after his death when grief hung thick, and Daniel had stayed close without being asked, fixing broken things, cooking simple meals, making sure Margaret wasn't alone with her thoughts, and she thanked him then, not formally but honestly, telling him how much his presence had meant when she felt invisible to the world, and Daniel listened quietly, his face serious, admitting that staying had helped him too, that caring for someone else had given him direction when he felt lost, and as the night deepened, he spoke about his fear of change, about how leaving felt like a risk not just of failure but of losing connection, and Margaret understood that fear because she had lived with it for years, choosing routine over risk, safety over growth, and she told him gently that distance does not erase love, that real bonds stretch without breaking, and that he was not abandoning her by choosing himself, and those words surprised her with their truth, because saying them out loud felt like opening a door she had kept shut, and Daniel looked at her then with gratitude and something close to relief, as if he had been carrying guilt he didn't know how to set down, and when they finally went inside, the house felt warmer, lighter, as if something heavy had been released, and the next morning arrived too soon, filled with final checks and quiet movement, and when Daniel hugged Margaret goodbye, it was long and steady, not rushed, not desperate, but full of shared understanding, and as she watched him drive away, the road emptying behind his car, Margaret felt the ache of loss but also a strange sense of calm, because beneath the sadness was a realization she could no longer ignore, that Daniel's decision had shaken her out of stillness, had reminded her that life does not end when one chapter closes, and as she turned back toward the house, now quiet and open, she felt something shift inside her, a question forming without fear, asking not what she had lost, but what might still be waiting, the months after. Daniel left past in a way Margaret did not expect, because instead of shrinking, her days slowly began to stretch outward, filling with small changes that first felt uncomfortable and then quietly empowering, and the house that once echoed with absence began to feel like a place of choice rather than waiting, and at first she moved carefully, unsure of herself, but one morning she accepted a flyer at the grocery store for a local library volunteer program, telling herself it was only a few hours a week, nothing serious, yet that single step shifted her routine, giving her reasons to wake early, conversations to join, and stories to share with people who did not see her as someone left behind but as someone present. And from there she joined a book club, started walking in the park instead of watching it from the window, and learned that loneliness fades faster when you meet it with motion. And in the evenings she wrote letters she never sent, not from sadness but from reflection. Finally allowing herself to feel years of quiet emotions she had kept organized and contained. And then one evening Daniel called, his voice bright and relaxed, telling her about Seattle, about his work helping families rebuild stability, about Emily standing beside him, supportive and patient, and Margaret listened with a full heart, hearing not distance but growth. And when he thanked her for believing in him, for teaching him that care does not demand control, she felt a deep warmth settle inside her, realizing that love given freely returns stronger. And after the call ended, she sat in her familiar chair by the window, noticing how the same falling leaves no longer felt like symbols of loss but of movement, and she understood then that Daniel's one decision had changed everything, not by taking something away but by opening a door she had been too careful to approach. And she began saying yes more often, to dinners, to conversations, to moments that once felt unnecessary. And one crisp evening she put on her coat and stepped outside without hesitation, walking into the cool air with purpose, knowing that life had not passed her by, it had simply been waiting for her to move again. And as she walked forward, steady and calm, Margaret felt gratitude instead of fear, because the future no longer looked empty, it looked open, and for the first time in years, she was ready to meet it.